I will focus a bit more on the contemporary context. And let me start by saying that the first time a group of economists, there were about 12 of us, fairly senior PhDs and faculty members from different universities, who formed the advisory panel of economists, of which I had the privilege of being the chairman, and Dr. Rashid Amjad was our extraordinarily capable convener. And we had the courage in 2008 to bring out a report which unambiguously said that Pakistan must give MFN status to India. And I remember Ejaz telling me, are you sure we should be doing this? I said, let's go ahead and do it. And of course, we made presentations to the federal cabinet. We also made presentations to the Prime Minister directly. And maybe this had some impact on the thinking. It was, by the way, extensively covered in Indian media. It also reminds me of 1993. Let me tell you a very quick story. When I was Commerce Minister, and it's a very simple arithmetic. We were deficit in cement at that time, and the Indians had surplus of cement across the border. We were importing cement from all, if you will find this unbelievable, from a remote location called Romania. And the costs were horrendous and delays in delivery. So I spoke to the Indian High Commissioner and he said, we can deliver it to you in a week's time. And the cost saving would be in this deal $25 million. So for a straightforward economist, this made eminent sense to me. And I informed the Prime Minister and he said, go ahead and do it. The Indians were good enough to tell me at that time that we do a quid pro quo. It will be a counter trade. We will take some items from you so that the balance doesn't look too bad. So we had the deal. When it went through, I was excited. I proudly decided to go to the press information department, do a press conference announcing this deal as a major victory. And guess what happened? As I finished, somebody from behind got up, showed my passport, and they said, you were born in India, you're a bloody Indian agent. No wonder you're signing a trade deal with India. Now, that made me realize exactly the point that Ejaz made about the kind of schizophrenic mindset that both sides of the border had on, unfortunately, our friendship. Now, look at some of the numbers very quickly, and you see that Pakistan's exports to India have remained somewhat stagnant since the last 5 years. Hardly $300 million or so. These are State Bank numbers, by the way. The Indian numbers tend to be somewhat different. Look at the exports by India to Pakistan. On the other hand, we do see substantial growth. And as of last year, the exports are close to $1.7 billion. Interestingly, the Indians are reporting a figure of $2.3 billion. So I wonder where that $600 million is going. You know where it is going, of course. I don't need to tell you. So, it's clear that Pakistan's dependence on Indian exports has increased somewhat, and by now India is in the top 10 exporters to Pakistan. Next, and look at the composition of trade. It's amazing the historical reversal that has taken place. Ejaz highlighted the fact that we were a net exporter of cotton and wheat and jute soon after partition. Today, we are one of the biggest importers of cotton from India. We imported cotton worth over $400 million, almost 1 million bales. And when we had a sugar deficit, we went to India, our next door neighbor, to get $650 million of sugar. So it's already happening. The gaps are being filled through neighboring sources of supply. India is our largest, biggest exporter of organic chemicals already. And substantial imports have been made of filaments and so on. On the other hand, the Pakistani numbers look very modest. Export from Pakistan, mineral fuels, byproducts, and promising export of cement, which has been blocked due to some non-tariff barriers, and some minor chemicals. It's very interesting when you look at the coverage of items that can be imported from India. Up to now, the first circle, we used to have something called the positive list. That comprised of 27% of the tariff lines. As you know, in the harmonized code, we have something like 7,000 tariff linings. The positive list allowed us to import roughly from 27% of the tariff lines. The other 73% remained effectively the negative list. Then after the famous cabinet decision that the judge referred to, we have moved from positive to a negative list. And the negative list now is 18% of the tariff lines, which effectively means that the positive list now is 82%. So overnight, from 27% positive list, we have effectively moved to 82% positive list. And this is only in the transition. Come 31st of December 2012, we will effectively have 100% positive list if we allow the lobbies not to influence our decisions. But that's not the end of the story. Beyond that comes the SAFTA, second phase implementation of concessionary tariffs. Pakistan has a sensitive list comprising about 18% of tariff lines. So the concessionary tariff regime with respect to India is going to be 82% of our tariff structure. Mind you, these are not trade-related numbers. It requires a lot of research to get to that, which we are currently doing. So the transition is huge, not only in terms of the coverage, but in terms of the regime of concessionary tariffs which will come following this final stage of implementation of SAFTA. The coverage of Indian imports from Pakistan, on paper at least, Indians gave us MFN status, so the positive list for us, historically since 95 and so on, has been more or less 100%. And then when the SAFTA process comes through, India has a much smaller sensitive list than we do, 12% or so. So something like 88% of tariff lines of India will be accessible to Pakistani exports. The issues, what are the issues? Why have Pakistan's exports to India remained small and stagnant despite so-called granting of MFN status by India? Hardly $300 million, which is just about 1% of our exports. Why are Indian exports, on the other hand, to Pakistan relatively large and buoyant despite restrictions in the form of a limited positive list? As of now, there were only about 27% of the items that could be imported from India. Yet, the Indians are seventh largest trading partner. Third, and that is the bottom line question, what is the prospect for the volume and balance of trade between India and Pakistan following the granting of MFN status? I think there are three possible explanations for this divergence in buoyancy between India and Pakistan in the regional trade. The first lies, of course, in the relative competitiveness of the two countries, and in particular, in a static sense. I think when Hijaz was talking of complementarity, he was talking of complementarity in a dynamic sense. I am talking about static complementarity as of today. We have to see to the extent to which the two economies are complementary. The second issue is the tariff structure in the two countries, the relative tariff structure in the two countries. And the third is the much emphasized woes and cries that India has non-trade barriers on Pakistan, which are severe and restrictive in character. And there is a general perception that maybe the principal reason why Pakistani exports have not grown to India is the non-tariff barrier problem, and not the other two factors. And our analysis will give you some indication as to what we think is the case. Now let's first look at the two tariffs. It's interesting that there is a fundamental difference between the tariff structures of the two countries. The data source here is untagged. India has much higher tariffs on agricultural products. 32% of the average as opposed to 17% for Pakistan. On non-agricultural commodities, the difference is very, very minor, more or less the same, between 10 to 13%. Indian farmers have historically enjoyed much more protection. And what is not visible in this figure is the subsidies to Indian farmers. Recent estimates are that Indian farmers receive something like $40 billion of subsidies. in fertilizer, in power, in diesel, in credit, and so on. The corresponding figure that we have been able to come to in Pakistan is about $2 to $2.5 billion. So even if you adjust for size, per capita basis, the Indian farmer is getting 2 to 3 times the subsidy that a Pakistani farmer gets, and that is clearly meant lower prices and more competitiveness for the Indian farmer. And it's not surprising that India today is exporting $7 billion of cotton. Who would have imagined 10 years ago that this would be happening? So, on agricultural commodities, the Indian tariffs are much higher. Now, it's interesting when you look at textiles. On paper, the Indian customs tariff has a dual tariff structure. It is 10% or a specific rate per unit, whichever is higher. And it turns out, unfortunately, in most cases, the specific rate is much higher. And I have found textile items where the actual effective ad valorem rate of the specific rate is in excess of 65 to 100%. So this has been their way of ensuring that the textile trade remains relatively protected, particularly on value-added textile products by India. Now let's turn to the trade complementarity question, and here we have the standard measure and international trade literature on the match between the imports of a country and the exports of the other country. How close are they to each other? A perfect match would be when Pakistan's imports are exactly Indian exports, for example. That would be when the index of trade complementarity becomes equal to 1. Now, as it turns out, and this has been done at the HSC code level on the 99 chapter, so we spent some time working on this. It's interesting that between Pakistan's imports and Indian exports, the ITC is 0.676. This is high by international standards. That means there are a large number of exports from India which potentially are required for import by Pakistan. And this, I must emphasize, is a static analysis. And particularly it does not get into trade creation possibilities. The second measure is between Pakistan's exports and Indian imports. I'm afraid the ITC is quite low at 0.230. This would tend to indicate that our export mix is really not very much of what India wants. Right? I mean, this is a tragic conclusion, but that is the unfortunate reality at this point in time. Hopefully, intra-industry specialization will develop and there will be dynamic benefits accruing to both countries of the Hejaz variety down the road. But as of now, in the static terms, there is a much greater likelihood of trade diversion into Pakistan from India rather than trade diversion into India from Pakistan. This is somewhat contrary to the results of the State Bank study which was done way back about 6-7 years ago, which highlighted more or less equal possibilities of trade diversion. So, we have observed where the match is very strong. We see that once this 27% positive list is taken away and 100% is made available to India, massive possibilities of increase in imports, especially in, interestingly, India is a big exporter today of mineral fuel and oil. I didn't know this. India exports fuel oil, which is what we need for a badly managed power plant. India is a very competitive exporter of electrical and mechanical machinery, and of course, they are already our biggest supplier of chemicals, and I have a strong suspicion that pharmaceuticals would be imported in large quantities, either legally or illegally. And then, of course, our recent study on the automotive sector done for the ITC demonstrates that at today's prices, even allowing for high tariffs on this sector by Pakistan, India is competitive in a vast range of vehicles. So, the conclusion, I'm afraid, is inevitable that the trade diversion possibilities for Pakistan from India much later. But there's good news behind this. The good news behind this is that to the extent that the Indians are cheaper, more competitive, that's good news for us because it will mean cheaper imports and overall savings in our import bill. I'm afraid in the short-run static terms, Pakistan will have to make its case with its people, not so much of rising exports as much as cheaper imports from India. Finally, let me turn to the non-tariff barrier issue which has been often emphasized. And we have calculated the equivalent tariffs. This is the World Bank's very useful trade restrictiveness index database, which shows that India has non-tariff barriers which in terms of the tariff equivalent are quite high, really quite high by international standards. On agriculture, the average rate here they said 28, earlier on we saw 32, but the difference between the two is 11. Unfortunately, Pakistan has not been included. And Sri Lanka, notice, truly liberal trade. No impact of non-tariff barriers. So I'm afraid there is something to this story that India has somewhat excessive non-tariff barriers. And although they have said that these are general in character, some are applied in practice specifically more intensively on Pakistan, including of course what Ejaz has highlighted, visa restrictions, choice of transport modes, limited banking channels, investment restrictions. India's investment policy, the first two lines in brackets says, this policy applies to all countries except Pakistan. So there is clear discrimination. So overall, yes, there is some impact of non-tariff barriers. We have raised the cost of entry to Pakistan into the Indian market in the case of agricultural products by almost 11 percentage points in equivalent tariff terms and somewhat less in terms of manufacturing. But my own humble submission is that when you look at the context of Indo-Pak trade, do look at all three factors. Not just be obsessed with the issue of non-tariff barriers. That is a barrier. But it's the issue of trade complementarity. Do we have the appropriate export mix in the short run to really take off in terms of growth? Issue is India has high tariff barriers in the two product ranges where we may have some dynamic comparative advantage, and that is agriculture and textiles. In both sectors, India has relatively high barriers. So all three factors combined, I have a feeling, have contributed to keeping Pakistani exports at an extraordinarily low level of only about $300 to $400 million in a market of over 1 billion people. Now how do we sell this? Because all of us are great believers in the need to grant MFN status to India, and we have no other option but to say that the benefit is going to be in terms of significant savings in the import bill. And even if our respective trade balance with respect to India deteriorates, because Indian imports could rise rapidly, maybe triple in the short run, however, our global trade balance will improve because imports as a whole would be cheaper. But I fear that the opponents to this liberalization, who are saying peace first and trade later, rather than trade first and peace later, would keep highlighting the lack of growth of exports. And in fact argue that the rise in Indian imports is a vacillation on the part of Pakistan. In my own humble view, it is extremely important that Pakistani exports show dynamism to India, and the Indians realize the sensitivity and accept the same kind of quid pro quo that they gave me in 2003 when they agreed to buy a few things in return for cement. That's our initial analysis, ladies and gentlemen, and of course we will continue to work in this area. Thank you very much.